The Polestar 3 is really good looking and sporty in terms of design, inside and out, as well as overall performance. And as for that Rivian R1T, it has the most real-world utility of any EV to date, and the company's leadership is consistently inspiring and operates like a senior executive of a major tech or automobile company should. That's all I'll say about that. Third and final, I've been searching and hoping really to find an EV that's as fun and satisfying to drive as a Tesla Model Y or 3. I'll be honest, those are the benchmarks. Did I find it? Stick around and find out. Okay, the Polestar 3, what a ride. After quickly and easily scheduling a test drive of the Polestar 3 via the Polestar website, I met the Polestar rep for the first test drive slot of the day at 10 o'clock on a Saturday. I mean, I was literally the first person at the experience center there in front of the door, but the door was still locked. So that aside, all was fine. Shortly thereafter, we briefly reviewed the vehicle from inside and out. He asked if I had any major questions. I've done my research. I really didn't. I was there to drive it and experience it, and I'm really glad I did, because you can't fully appreciate this vehicle unless you test drive it. So once I got it out and about, I was really impressed, and I also did my informal large backpack utility tests so you all could have a better sense of space and utility, and I'll show you those photos now. What the frunk? As you will see in these photos, the frunk of the Polestar 3 is somewhat negligible. Large enough to comfortably hold charging cables and small accessories, but likely too small to hold a backpack. It's bigger than any of the Kia frunk nonsense, which seems very much like an afterthought in those vehicles. So that's a plus for the Polestar, but it's still not super useful. The good news is that all Polestars come with a charging cable with a decent trickle charge, and that's exciting. There's not an immediate subscription that you need to sign up for, so another plus. Note the compartment wall divider in the frunk is solid and not removable, which I think is really an easy miss. Without it there, the frunk would actually be a dash more usable and wouldn't require much redesign. I probably could have completely fit my backpack in there if that divider wasn't there. So I'm really curious why they did that. I think it's about organization of cables and that sort of thing, but work on that, Polestar. We expect more utility from an EV that costs over $70,000. So while the frunk is very small, I would say that the trunk is similar to that of a small but decent sized SUV. While the trunk has good utility, it could have more if the Polestar had not prioritized rear seat legroom over trunk space or utility. Now, if that's something that you're prioritizing, then the Polestar 3 is for you. I mean, it very comfortably fits 4 people, and I would probably argue that it comfortably fits, 5 people with 3 across the back. While that makes the rear seat legroom the best of any EV in its class by my unofficial estimation, other than the low seating height, it still makes the Polestar more of a sedan utility vehicle than a sport utility vehicle. However, if rear seat comfort, again, and legroom is more important to you than long road trip utility, I think that this Polestar 3 is really compelling, and is, by far an excellent choice. From my large backpack utility test, you can see just barely how the backpack fit under the subtrunk. I think you could barely fit 2 under there, which is slightly smaller than the Model Y, but good enough to be considered useful. I still think there's probably room to make it bigger. While sporty, if not elegant, the sloping roof and lack of trunk depth still makes trunk room smaller than the Model Y. So if you're cross-shopping there, that's not really the greatest comparison, but if you're looking for the better looking vehicle, the sportier looking vehicle, and arguably the better handling vehicle, then this is the one for you. But With all the seats folded, you do have enough room to store large items, and I think that there's maybe a limited advantage to the Y there. But I think there's just enough room for a medium soft kennel and two suitcases and two backpacks with the seats folded up and just using the trunk as you normally would. All right, the cockpit on this thing. The Polestar 3 is built like a modern fighter jet, inside and complete with a heads-up display, an actual driver's display behind the steering wheel. That is the best I have seen of any EV to date. And it has a menagerie of high-quality, environmentally friendly materials throughout. Almost everything is upgradable from stereo to seat belts, and when you start upgrading, that's where the Polestar 3 jumps into high-end luxury vehicle mode and can get a little bit frustrating if you're trying to even get remotely near the price point of a fully loaded Model Y. At any trim level, though, however, this car is better looking inside and out, as well as more unique than anything else on the road, save for the Rivians. And if you don't care about all-wheel drive and the handling that comes with that and the all-weather capability, then the rear-wheel drive single motor Polestar 3 that comes in under 70,000 is, definitely worth a solid look. For safety, it's got it all from admittedly grippy regen brakes, which I really liked, to LiDAR if you want it on the higher trims. I will note that unlike any Tesla or Fisker I've driven, during my 30-minute accompanied test ride in DC and on the highway, no alarms or chimes rang, and all the info I needed for driving was right in front of me. I didn't have to crane my neck over to look at the center console. I knew what my speed was at all times. I mean, it really, really makes a difference. I love that a lot. Let's talk about rear seat legroom again. Like a Dutch model, the Polestar 3 has rear legroom for days. While the seating position is lower than most, you can honestly stretch your legs very easily. This makes the rear seat area easy to climb in and out of for anyone from kids to adults, and is an excellent design factor which takes advantage of the extremely low center of gravity with the battery sitting lower than most, I think, it seems, which also makes the Polestar 3 better handling wise than the Mustang Mach-e and as good as the Tesla Model Y, minus it being a dash more torquey, but not quite as quick. But maybe you like a dash of wildness. You get that, especially when you punch the pedal on this thing. The Polestar 3 is extremely easy to drive. I love the regen on the Polestar 3 more than the Model Y. It's confidently grippy, but so are the suspension and tires. It stays firmly planted in a straight line or in turns or curves unless you punch the pedal, wherein you will see the rear wheel drive bias as the front end rises up enough for you to notice. But you don't get all the chimes and alarms, which I really felt became more noticeable in the Polestar 3 in the fact that it just lacked those. And I don't know what settings were turned on or turned off, but it really was kind of noticeable and I didn't miss them. As far as how it handled, that could have been from one of the three suspension settings, I think, that were in the menu. And there are a lot of center screen drive customizations, just as there are in a Model Y. But I honestly think I like the layout just as much as the Tesla. I won't say more than the Tesla. It's definitely different, but it just has a more simplified look. And I think things might be less buried than in the Teslas. Anyway, I think a software update could tighten the front end rise that you experience when you punch the accelerator, and just balance the all-wheel drive a bit more, so it's a bit more even. I think right now it's probably at least 60% in the back and 40 up front. But if you got that closer to a 50-50, not a complete 50-50, because that wouldn't be a good idea, you would experience less of that. Anyway, the only thing I'll knock perhaps is that the reverse view on the center screen when you're putting the vehicle into reverse. Gives you a split screen of two views. One is from the top of the vehicle down, and one is from the rear back, more the traditional view. I found that really distracting, and I think you can update that, what view you want, but it just became difficult to look at, backing up in the vehicle for the first time. I'm sure I'd get used to it. And again, I think you can customize it, but I didn't love that. I'd like one or the other, but not both. Otherwise, I found the overall non-distracting driving experience with everything working as it should really rewarding and honestly surprising. Overall, I came away pleasantly surprised with the Polestar Model 3. It's almost worth all the money. We're talking over 70K if you put any option on this thing. But if you don't want a Tesla in 2025, this is a good option, which is in many ways is better than a Tesla, and in some others it falls short. I also got to see and sit in the Polestar 4, which was not why I was there, but I was kind of drawn to it, especially once I sat on the inside. It's aimed squarely at the Model Y and the Model 3, in my opinion, and will be priced accordingly, very closely to it, unless, again, you start speccing it with options. It can get close to 80K if you fully load it. Um, I don't love not having a rear window in the Polestar 4. I don't think most will, but I think you could get used to it. You could get used to it, but the rest of the vehicle, inside and out, was absolutely beautiful. I mean, honestly, striking. They're going for the jugular. If they can get the Polestar 4 out next year and tighten up the price just a bit and sort of streamline the options, I think they might have a really killer alternative. But again, we're here to talk about the Polestar 3, and I think the Polestar 3 has just a dash more utility than the Polestar 4. But again, if you were torn between a Model 3 and a Model Y, the Polestar 4 is a dash more sedan than SUV, and the Polestar 3 is a dash more SUV than sedan, if that makes sense. Anyway, I think they're seriously going to compete for EV buyers and are way better looking inside and out than any American or Korean EV company are currently offering. But just be prepared to drop 70K on a Polestar no matter what you're buying, especially if it's the Polestar 3, and 60K on a Polestar 4 decently equipped, and just skip most of the upgrades because, again, the Polestar 3 and the Polestar 4 are both really great cars as is. All right, now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the Rivian R1T, which I also experienced in the same day, and that was purposeful because I wanted to go from one to the next. So I went from the Polestar 3 Experience Center directly to the Rivian R1T test drive place. It was a very different experience. I was going from a DC urban city experience center, similar to a, car dealership showroom, to literally driving out to Tyson's Corner in Northern Virginia and in the cold, waiting for my turn to drive the R1T underneath, a tent. So it was a very different experience, but they're two very different brands. And for the most part, I think they're going for very different customers, although the price points are very similar. So that is why I test drove these. Both are great alternatives, I think, to the Tesla. But again, very different driving experiences, very different brands. The R1T was a completely different experience, from what I was coming from. And while super enjoyable, seemed more of a, I don't know, desperate's not the right word, but they were more pushy at the Rivian test drive experience than the the person was at the Polestar Experience Center. So one was super chill, and the other was super busy. And so that may say something. There weren't a lot of people that were coming in for test drives. There was a trickle coming into the Polestar dealership. There was, kind of a queue of people waiting to test drive the Rivian. So I think at least every 15 minutes, someone was launching on a test drive in either an R1S or an R1T. So again, on the Rivian experience, there were a lot of Rivian employees there, a surprising amount. And for a company that's really struggling to make a profit, I'm sorry to say this, but I think there were far too many Rivian employees there. In fact, a couple were, resting in idle vehicles, and maybe they were on break, but it seemed like they had more employees there than they needed. Now, every test drive needed to be accompanied, just like in the Polestar. These are very expensive cars, and they don't want people crashing them or running off with them, I imagine. But honestly, I think they probably could have had the staff there and nobody would have rioted. But getting back to the experience, which is why you're here, having driven, I should admit, an R1S that I think was a late 2023 model, and now having driven an R1T 2025 model, I honestly was more impressed with the R1T 2025 model. I think they have made some significant adjustments. I really was unimpressed, relatively speaking, with the R1S when I drove it. It really drove like an electric truck. I mean, if that is what you want, you still want it to feel like a truck, it definitely does that. The R1T surprisingly felt like a more intimate cockpit. It was, not as cavernous inside, obviously, because you don't have a third row. But I honestly felt like I was, tiny inside of an R1S, and it was like way more space than I needed. The R1T felt like more of an intimate driving experience. And if you're trying to, cross compare Rivian with Tesla, the R1T kind of makes more sense because it honestly feels more similar inside in terms of the size of the cockpit. So a couple other people said that, to include Rivian employees. So I know I'm not crazy. Anyway, in their defense, they had about a dozen vehicles running test drives, with one R1S and one R1T on display for review by those interested. So it definitely was a busy place, and you didn't really get as much hands-on time as you would like. It wasn't, unenjoyable, but it definitely was a different experience from Polestar. It definitely felt more like an established brand than Polestar. And again, having just driven a 2023 R1S this past summer and been somewhat underwhelmed with it being too big and too loud and too truck-like for an EV. Again, had really low expectations, so it was nice to be surprised, which is kind of what I wanted. I wanted to feel pleasantly surprised. But the 2025 R1T, just really surprised me. And like the Polestar 3, I loved it, but for very different reasons. As for utility on the R1T, no surprise. Honestly, it has more than most people need. Two backpacks in my, unofficial backpack test. Fit pretty easily in the front alone, with room for your charging cables and wet gear and stuff for your one last trip to the beach on a vacation. So that was nice. As for space inside the vehicle, I actually find the R1T, again, the cabin more intimate than the R1S, which felt cavernous and uncomfortable as a result. If you're looking for something passenger-wise that has the legroom of a Model Y, but the utility of an F-150 Lightning, this might be the very vehicle you're looking for. And man, do I love that gear tunnel behind the cabin. I know PETA might freak out, but if you open the pass through from the gear tunnel to the cabin via the sliding door behind the armrest, this is the perfect kennel area for a medium-sized dog. There's plenty of room to turn around, which is important. For the dog to be comfortable, you could put a bed in there and they can lie down, and you could pass food and water back there to the dog, which is not something you could do if the dog was in the truck bed, and is not something if the dog was in a kennel all the way in the back of an SUV. So, if you're going to get angry with me about that being cruel or unusual, I honestly think that it is a better situation than traveling in with a dog in a kennel in the very back of an SUV, where they might not get much air conditioning, where they'll get the heat of the sun coming through the glass, etc. You get none of that, via the gear tunnel. It's nice and cool in there. I think a dog would honestly be more comfortable, and I would argue just as safe, if not more safe. But I know I'm probably going to hear about it, so bring it on. Gear tunnel, super unique. Nobody else has it. I love it. As for the drive, the 2025 R1T drives surprisingly like a pickup, the size of a Ford Maverick, though. It's firmly planted. They have both softened the bouncy ride and tightened the dampeners, it seems, compared to the 2023 R1S, which really felt like driving an electric Tahoe. I don't know how else to compare it. The R1S has the size and utility inside of like a Suburban, but the actual physical footprint of a Tahoe, either way, it feels enormous inside. You don't have that same experience in the R1T, and again, you really can't understand that until you test drive the R1T, and you need to test drive the R1S. Both are fantastic vehicles and have tons of utility, but I think the R1S might appeal a little bit more, to suburbanites, while the R1T fits very comfortably in a suburban setting or in a rural setting. I mean, I think it's just got more utility to it. And again, the driving experience is really tight. It took corners well. It didn't feel super heavy. It was just a balanced ride, and definitely felt improved from the earlier version of the R1S. So I also love the screens in the R1T. I love having a screen with all the information I need, like speed and what the ride height is and what drive mode I'm in, all in front of me, just behind the steering wheel, versus having to concentrate all my driving brain power on a center screen when I need it. I like having that, those two screens, and the way Rivian has executed it, I think, is the best of all the EVs that I have seen to date. It's not too much screen, it's just enough. So and the displays look great, the new animations and that sort of thing. I did find, kind of like, looking for what I wanted, um, while on its surface things seemed really simplified. I do feel like uh, the stuff you want to get to that's maybe more nuanced is a bit more buried. I'm sure once you got used to the interface, it would be pretty simple. And there's great, frequently reached functions up front, like temperature control and volume and that sort of thing. But, other features are more buried in the displays, and um, it's not as intuitive as, say, the Polestar systems. So I give Polestar the edge on that in terms of functionality. The visibility from inside the truck is superb. I mean, cabin room is all you need, with plenty of space for things in front of the center console, underneath it, in the center console, which is really kind of narrow and deep. There's a glove box now, and there's still storage under the front two seats and even under the back seat, which folds up to reveal, as you might have guessed it, more storage. So holy cow, there is just a ton of utility in this vehicle. Obviously, the truck bed, I think is just the right depth. And if you've got the plugs back there for running electric appliances, and you've got the air pump back there, and then if you get the tonneau cover, I think that's probably a good thing to do for a lot of reasons, to include range, but protecting gear you have back there. And if you can afford it, I think splurging for the automatic one would probably be worth it. You wouldn't regret it. I think they've made some improvements to it, and it worked really well while I played with it. So, and you can also operate it from inside the vehicle. You can operate it from the app. You can operate it from the key fob. I mean, it's really, really cool. So, now let's talk about the appeal of the R1T. This is definitely a vehicle designed for outdoor enthusiasts. That is who they're going for, and man, I think they've nailed it more than anybody else. While the R1S might have a dash more appeal as an environmentally friendly grocery getter, this is the one for those who want to take it to do more than pick up kids from soccer practice or run to the grocery store. I know that sounds really strange because the R1S has plenty of off-road capability, but once you see it and you see how large it is, I mean, I really think that it's almost like trying to take a suburban off-road. I mean, it definitely looks and feels a dash larger than a Tahoe, and I don't see a lot of Tahoes going off-road these days. And so, given it's also gets really expensive really quick, I just don't think that most people would be very comfortable taking it off-road. Not to say that I'm going to be, entering the Baja with an R1T, but at least I feel more comfortable that banging this thing up, it's a pickup truck. It's meant to do that. As for the R1S, I don't get that same sort of feeling. I love both of them, but I feel like the R1S is too big. And if what I want is cabin space for 4 people in my family and room to pick up a friend, plenty of room for that, and then all the utility you want, to either just throw things in a truck bed or to put in the gear tunnel or put under the seats. I mean, it's just got everything you want. But holy shit, both these vehicles are still too expensive, and I'm really surprised that Rivian at this point hasn't been able to get the price of the vehicles down more significantly with all the changes and updates they've made with losing wiring. But if you've got the money, they're both super compelling.